I know it's 1 minute early, but we're going to really break all records and start 1 minute early. My name is Ragui Assaad, and I am here substituting for Dr. Ahmed Galal, who could not be with us this morning. And I just got off a flight at 4 o'clock this morning, so don't have too many thoughts to give you before this workshop starts. Hopefully by the end we can have more thoughts. So I think we're going to just dive right in. I'd like to welcome you all first, and thank you for coming all the way here. And those of you who haven't been in these beautiful ERF premises, we're lucky to have this place, to have these intimate conferences and workshops. So as you know, this is the first of a series of 3 workshops that will be back-to-back on education and labor market issues. And we will start with the research competition on education policy in the ERF region. So I'm going to just dive right in. The first paper is by Meltem Dayioglu, Murat Kirdar, Abdurrahman Aydemir, and myself, and it's on returns to schooling in Egypt. And the second paper is by Reham Riz and Hala Abu Ali about comparable estimates to returns to schooling, evidence from MENA countries. And then our discussant is Dr. Insan Tunra from Koç University. So we'll start with Meltem. I don't know if they told you how much time you have.
20 minutes.
20 minutes.
20 minutes? Yeah, okay, yeah. It's plenty of time. Okay, hi everyone. Our paper is entitled Returns to Schooling in Egypt. So we're basically looking at, well, and this is a joint project, as Ragui has just mentioned, with Murat, Abdurrahman, myself, and Ragui. Okay, so the aim of this project is to estimate the causal effect of schooling on earnings in Egypt. So we ask a very simple question, but for those of you who've tried doing this type of work, you know that answering it is not so easy. So the identification basically relies on the reduction in primary schooling in Egypt from 6 to 5 years in 1988. So I will explain how, for the non-Egyptians, how this was working. As you know, there's a lot of literature on the returns to schooling, but we're basically looking at identifying the causal effect. And the causal side, there's a growing volume of work in developed countries, and I have listed some of the most commonly cited ones, and some of them use the quarter of birth as the instrument for completed years of schooling. That's by Angus and Kruger. And some others are using the regional variation in the United States in terms of the start date of the age that you start schooling or the age that you leave schooling. And those are mostly for the US, and then there is a number of work on the UK that look at the changes in compulsory schooling, the duration of schooling in the UK. But those are of course, they've done these laws way back in time, so they go back into 1947, 73. The interesting thing is that there is no consensus on what the return is. I mean, some studies find the return to be like 0% in Germany, and some find it as high as 15%. If I don't remember incorrectly, CARD's 1990 work was like 10%, I think. He comes up with an estimate of around 10%. So, but the returns are very varied. When we come to developing countries, there's much less work on this. And some of the studies I just listed down here is from Indonesia, from Taiwan. There's a growing volume of work from China, which is very interesting. And there's also a paper by Murat and Abdurrahman on Turkey. Estimated returns, again, is quite varied. I mean, Abdurrahman and Murat, for instance, find for Turkey that the return is about 0% for men. And there's a paper for China that says 20%, but the most recent work that I've read on China was about 2%. So and they actually criticize the 20% work, and they're saying that they're not have done it properly. Anyway, so there is a lot of estimates out there, which are very different. So we basically aim to contribute to this literature by providing a case study from Egypt and using, again, the exogenous variation in schooling brought about by the change in compulsory schooling that I will mention in a minute. So the education system in Egypt is the following. There's 6 years of primary schooling, there's 3 years of middle school, and then 3 years of upper secondary. Up until 1980, compulsory schooling was 6 years. In 1981, it was changed to 9 years by adding the middle school into the primary cycle. Interesting thing is the following. In 1988, they reduced primary schooling from 6 to 5 years. Hence, compulsory schooling reduced from 9 to 8 years. And in 1999, they reversed this back, making primary schooling, again, from 5 to 6 years, hence the compulsory schooling increased from 8 to 9 years. So basically, you were using this reduction in primary schooling by 1 year in 1988 as an exogenous variation in completed years of schooling. That's the identification that we shall be using. Let me just tell you, just very briefly, that we also looked at how compulsory schooling, the change from 6 to 3 years, whether that affected. In fact, we started out not this project, but we were looking at whether we could actually replicate some of the work that we have done for Turkey for Egypt. And in fact, there we did not see much of a change with compulsory schooling when it went up from 6 to 3. You would expect enrollment to increase quite a bit, and we don't actually see a jump there. So it seems that it wasn't enforced very strictly, or strictly at all, I suppose, because there is no effect there at all. So when you look at the stock, you see actually that when you look at the adult population, there's like a 30% with no education. But then you also see that upper secondary education, which is close to like high school education, 30% of the population have attained this. So we have a bimodal distribution where primary and lower secondary is much lower, but then you have these very highly educated people and you have these very low educated people out there at the same time. So the data, we're basically relying on the 2012 Egypt Labor Market Panel Survey because it provides detailed schooling and labor market information. It has close to 50,000 individuals from 12,000 households. The operational sample, we're relying on 15, 20-year-olds to 45 years old. The upper age limit is dictated by data because the detailed education questions in 2012 were only asked of individuals who are younger than 45 years old. So that's why we have set the upper limit to 45. The lower limit we try with 15 and we also try with 20. The reason for 20 is because at age 15 there are people still in school, so it might make more sense perhaps to look at 20 to 45 years old individuals. We're also using the 2006 data primarily because individuals who were interviewed in 2006 and who were re-interviewed in 2012, they were not asked of the schooling questions because they were already collected in 2006. So we had to get the data from 2006 to 2012, but that's how much we use the 2006 data. So the most important variable here is perhaps the schooling variable, how we generated this, because in fact that's the whole thing rests here. We know the last schooling level completed, so the respondent will say, I have graduated from primary school or high school, whatever it is. Because we're using this change in the schooling law from 5 to 6 and 6 to 5, we need to know who completed 6 years of primary schooling and who completed 5 years of primary schooling, because those are the guys that we're interested in. There is a question in the questionnaire that asks whether ask the respondent, did you go through the 6-year cycle or did you go through the 5-year cycle in the primary school? But it's only asked of very few respondents. And therefore, we could not use that data. So what we have done is the following. We know the year that individuals entered school. Okay, so we said, okay, well, they've started school in X year. We know whether or not they have repeated grades. So what we have done is to start them, whatever the date they have said, and then look at where they were, including the repetitions, where they were when the law went into effect. And then using that, we know whether or not they're affected from the change in the compulsory schooling law. I mean, that's how we're basically looking at, that's how we are calculating the years of schooling, how many years of schooling they have completed. Okay, so I mean, so we're not actually generating the data ourselves. It's not like if you said primary school and this is the year that you went to primary school, we're adding you 5 or 6. We're actually going back to the data and then starting from the year they have started school, and then in that way we're calculating the number of years of schooling that they have had. Because that way we know whether they were subject to 5 or 6 years of schooling. I hope it's clear, yeah? Am I making myself clear? All right, so the methodology is the 2-stage least squares. In the first stage, we are estimating the years of schooling. D is the dummy, and that's the policy. The policy, I will mention in a minute, depends on the law, when the law went into effect, so it's going to be 1 or 0. X's are the variables that we're using. Covariates. And as covariates, we're only using the regions where they were, whether they were residing in urban and rural areas, and we're also using age dummies to take into account the any time trend in years of schooling. In the second stage, we're looking at the log of the wages, and again, the years of schooling, we're interested in beta 1. Of course, that's the key parameter of interest for us because that's going to denote the returns to schooling, returns to education. Okay, the policy dummy is 1 for those born in 1978 or later, and 0 for others. So that's D is going to be equal to 1 for those who were born after 1978. The 1977 cohort, these guys are partially treated. I mean, some group are exposed to, depending on whether they started school late or early, they might have been exposed to the law or they might not have been. And therefore, we've decided that we will take the 1977 out because we're not so sure whether they are, but I will show you the pictures with the 77 in or out so you can see what happens. So we thought that for the audience it might be interesting because, I mean for the literature in general, because most papers that I have showed you, they look at the increase in schooling through compulsory schooling. So this is an interesting exercise because we now have a reduction. One interesting thing about the reduction is the following. We say that there's no compiler problem in the sense that because it's reduced instead of increased, it's not like you're going to insist on going through 6 years of primary schooling. If the law says primary school is 5 years, you cannot choose to go to primary school for 6 years. That's it. And that's what we mean by no complier problem. Of course, we don't mean to say that there is no dropout of schooling. Of course, you can drop out any moment that you like, especially when there is no, enforcement. Exactly. All right. Another interesting aspect, which because we've done and Abdurrahman and Murat have done a similar paper for Turkey, in the Turkish case, when they have increased schooling from 5 to 8 years, they have changed the primary schooling, so there is no primary schooling any longer. There's 8 years of basic education, and there's no diploma in the middle. So when there's no, in the Turkish case, for instance, it changes the diploma that you receive because they've eliminated the 1 diploma now. There's only 2 diplomas left after basic education, after high school. In the Egyptian case, this is not the case. You still have these diplomas, right? So we think that there should not be any sheepskin effect because now if you go through high school, for instance, one group, well, you still have the high school diploma, but one group will have the diploma with 11 years of schooling, One group will have the diploma with 12 years of schooling. That's going to be the difference. And in that sense, this is a better exercise than when the diploma is also changed, because in that case, there's also this added sheepskin effect. Okay, this is a picture. We've calculated the average years of schooling by birth cohorts for wage earners. And here, what we expect to see is for the, remember this 1970-year cohort is the first cohort to be affected from the change. So we expect to see a drop in the completed years of schooling because of the reduction. And this is what you actually see from the graph. But at the same time, when we remember the 1977 cohort, they might be affected, they might not be affected. They are the partially treated group. When we take them out, you see a much clearer picture.
What are the dots?
The dots are just observation points, the averages.
The averages
Yeah.
for that year.
For that cohort. And at the 95 confidence intervals.
At various levels of these are averages of
Averages. For this 1970 cohort, what is the average? And 71 cohort, 72 cohort,
There's more than one average per year.
shouldn't be. Yeah.
I see 4 dots for every year, so maybe,
Is it?
yeah, I mean, if you look at vertically,
Perhaps that's, we've done, I think, this is Murat's picture, so that's I hesitated. But what we have done also is to include in the birth month. So that's probably why there are more than 1 dots. So in generating to get more variation, we've also included in here, because we know that the month of the, when they were born, so we have also included that information. And then that comes from that. So the first stage results, I'm going to show you a number of different specifications. So this is where we regress. On the left-hand side, we have the years of schooling, and on the right-hand side, we have the dummy, whether treated or not, 78 plus. And this excludes the 1977 cohort. And we have the birthday there, birthday squared, birthday cubed, birthday times treated. So different specifications. These are all different specifications to see how we predict the years of schooling. And as you can see, I mean, the reason we include the birthdays and squares and the cubes is to take into account any trends in years of schooling over the cohorts. And as you can see here, and there are 2 groups, 20 to 45 years old and 25 to 45 years old, and you can see that for the treated group it's all negative. Okay, so we observe that, in fact, the treatment has reduced the completed years of schooling. The next slide is for men. Again, you see reductions for different specifications, consistently negative. For women, we don't see anything. This is, just to say it again, this is for the wage workers only, not for all the women. When you look at the sample for all women, of course you see a reduction. But for the wage earners, we don't have a first stage. That's the conclusion that we get from this picture. And therefore, we don't do the rates of return for women because we don't have a first stage. So we concentrate only on men, looking at the sample of men. And then we repeat the same exercise for full-time wage workers. Full-time we define as those with 30 hours plus per week. And again, you see similar results as the previous one. Again, for all groups that we were considering. And again, for women, we don't get anything. So we just eventually drop women, but just want to show you that we don't get a first stage for women. And then we try some exercises. So we're concerned that perhaps the policy variable, I mean, how do we know exactly that it is because of the policy that we are observing a drop? So what we have done is to do a falsification test. They call it a placebo, whatever treatment, where you just define it treated by not taking remember the year of treatment in 1978, so we just arbitrarily changed it to 1973. Let's say that the law went into effect in 1973. What would have happened? 74, 75, 76. So that's the exercise. So we're just changing the definition of the demi-variable. And as you can see there, the only time that we get a significant effect is when we define it for 1978 plus. Disregard the 1977, because in this picture I had actually taken the 77 out, but I left the column there. Okay? So this sort of, to convince the reader that it is actually the policy change that has given rise to this drop. This is another exercise to convince ourselves that it is a policy that is driving these results, is to say that, well, this policy naturally affects those who have completed primary schooling and should not be affecting others. So if you have dropped out, if you went to primary school for 3 years and dropped out, naturally the law doesn't affect you because you only went to 3 years of primary schooling. So this exercise, starting from the left, it includes all education groups, and then we gradually drop more educated ones until we have the least educated on the right-hand side. So if you have less than, for instance, for the group of individuals who are not literate, we don't expect to see a reduction in years of schooling, and we don't. For those who have not completed the primary cycle, again, we don't expect to see a drop, and we don't. The only time we start seeing a negative effect and a significant coefficient is when we do it for the middle school, high school, and post-secondary, stuff like that. Okay, so this is just an exercise to convince ourselves that it is a policy effect. And now when we come to the second stage results, again, only for the male wage earners, and using the birth year squared, birth year cubed specification. The OLS results for, let's say, 25, 45-year-olds, it shows that the returns to education in Egypt is 2.8%. The IV results show a return of 6.6%, so quite a bit higher. So why might this be happening? I mean, we might have expected a drop in years of in the rate of return to schooling with the IV because of because of ability, we're not controlling for ability, because of family networks, we're not controlling for that. I mean, this is the reason why we want to do IV anyway. So you would expect that, for instance, you would expect for those reasons that the IV estimates should be lower than the OLS estimate, but then there is also the measurement error. So if there's measurement error in years of schooling, we might actually see an increase instead of a decrease. So here, I mean, that's probably one of the explanations why we see an increase in years of schooling. At the bottom of the panel, it shows you the full-time, for full-time workers, what is happening. And as you can see, the estimates are very similar. So it really doesn't matter whether you're working full-time or not. The estimates are quite similar. I'm going to skip these. We also tried the public and the private, but we don't do it for selection. And I'm not so sure whether we need to discuss it further before we present it to you. Those were just simple exercises. So just to conclude the paper, we do the causal estimation. I mean, that's the contribution, our contribution to the literature. First stage results, we do actually see a drop in completed years of schooling. But we don't have a first stage for women wage workers. We do some robustness checks. Perhaps we can do more of it, I don't know. And we do observe a decline because of the policy. And in the second stage, we get about a 6.6% rate of return. Okay, so that's it.
Thank you very much, Meltem.